this video, we'll build a basic game of Sudoku. We'll build an application where you can fetch the puzzle from an API and have a GUI application where you can solve it. So there won't be an autosolver in this version. That would probably be there in a future video, maybe the next video. But right now we're building a very basic version which you can solve yourself. So for example, the image you're seeing here is the final output of our code. So in this version, you can input the digits at the location which you want, and yeah, so this is the basic functionality we are aiming for in this video, just the basic layout and the functionality of adding the digits to the layout. Okay, so let's look at the steps which we'll be following. So first we'll build the Pygame window, this entire window. Then we'll make the Sudoku layout, the grids, and then we'll populate the Sudoku via an API. So we'll use an API to get these initial values, the 7438 which you see out here. And lastly, we'll add the user functionality which is used to input these digits 2145 onto the Sudoku screen. Okay, so let's get started. So since the first step is setting up Pygame, it's the same as the previous two videos. So basically we'll just import Pygame. We'll have pygame.init for initializing Pygame. We'll create the window using pygame.display.setMode window using this width, and we are setting the caption out here. And this is the functionality that if we press the quit button in a Pygame window, the window will quit. Okay, so let's just run this. Yeah, so as you can see, we got a window out here, and yeah, so this was as expected. So let's add the grid now. So in order to add the grid, what we'll need to do is we'll have a loop. Okay, so we'll have a loop which will run for 10 times, and it will make each of those rows and columns of the grid. So we have this background color, and we'll fill the window with this. So win.fill background color. Okay, so we are setting the this background color to the window. And now let's make the grids. So for I in range 0 to 10. So as you saw in the figure earlier, a Sudoku is basically a 9x9 grid, right? We'll need 10 lines on the vertical and 10 lines on the horizontal. Okay, so let's draw these vertical and horizontal lines by pygame.draw.line, and the parameters out here will be win. This will be line, and the color would be black. And so this will be the starting coordinate, and this will be the ending coordinate. And let's say we have a width of 2. Okay, so this will be basically the vertical line, and let me copy paste it, and this will be the horizontal line. So we need to specify the starting and ending coordinates of these lines. So let's say I want to have the x coordinate as 50. Okay, so the x coordinate of the first line is 50, and let's say I want to have an iteration, a difference of 50 in each iteration. So I'll add 50 times I, since the first iteration of I is I equals to 0, next will be I equals to 1, 2, 3, and so on. In every iteration, this will add a value of 50 to my x coordinate. As for the y coordinate, for the vertical lines, the y coordinate in the starting point would be a constant for each of the lines, since y coordinate is this distance from the x coordinate. Okay, so once this is done, I'll explain once again with the help of the figure. So let's say that the y coordinate is 50. So this is our starting coordinate, and for the ending coordinate, if you can guess, the y coordinate would again remain constant, but it would be a different value. So that value would be, let's say, 500, and the x coordinate would be represented by this same equation which we wrote earlier. Since if you imagine the line, the x coordinate of the starting point and ending point would remain the same. So I'll show in the figure once I run the code. So let's comment this, and I'll have a pygame dot display dot update. So you can see that we got these 10 vertical lines out here. So what I was explaining, the y coordinate is this distance from basically the x-axis. Okay, So this distance is the y coordinate, and for the vertical lines, for the starting point, the y coordinate remains constant, and the x coordinate, the equation for the x coordinate remains the same for a particular line. Okay, so this, for this line, for the starting point and the ending point, the x coordinate is the same, and the y coordinate for this point is 50 and the y coordinate for this point is 500. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So let's draw the remaining lines. So we'll draw the horizontal lines now. So as you may have guessed, for the horizontal lines, it will be the opposite of the vertical lines. So we'll have the x coordinate, which is constant for the starting point, and the y coordinate, which is varying as 50 plus 50 times I. Okay, and for the ending point, it will be 500 comma 50 plus 50 times I. Yeah, so we got the grid out here. So you can see it's a very beautiful grid, and these are all the 9 cross 9 boxes. So as you may have noticed, the Sudoku contains some bold lines, right? So the lines which separate each of the boxes is bold. So that is every third line. So what we can do is we can add a functionality out here if I modulus 3 equals 0. So for every third line, we'll draw a bold line. So just these exact same lines we have to draw in bold. Okay, so for this width, I'll change it to 4. Let's check it out now. Unexpected indent. Okay. Yeah, so this is the layout which you may have seen in all the Sudokus. So we have these block 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and this is a 9 cross 9 grid, and we can start populating these grids now. Okay, so that is our third step, and we're moving on to it now. So we have to call an API and fetch those values which will be filling in our Sudoku. Now the reason for doing that is we can't just input any random numbers into our Sudoku. We need to have a proper set of values which can be solved. Okay, so I found this amazing site called Sudoku. They have an API which you can hit and they will provide you Sudoku boards for free. So we'll import requests. So request is the library used in Python for making these get calls and post calls as well. Okay, I'll have to add a couple of parameters out here. So I'll make the API call right in the beginning of the code so we can populate our grid later with those elements. Okay, so let's say response equals requests dot get. So we are making a get request out here. Even if you don't know anything about APIs, don't worry. It's just 2 lines of code, and you can just imagine that you just got your values from this particular site. Okay. Okay, so this is the link, and I'm setting the difficulty as easy for now. And now we have to extract the board from this response that we have got. So we'll store that in a variable called grid, and grid equals response dot json, and the parameter we're searching for inside of this JSON response is board. Okay, so this will transfer the grid into our variable grid. Okay, so yeah, this is the API part. Yeah, that's it. So we have got the board in our grid. Okay, so since we'll be manipulating this particular grid, so what we can do is we can have another variable containing the same grid which we won't manipulate. So this will help in comparison at the end. So the only purpose of making this variable is for comparison. And the reason why I'm doing this in a complicated fashion other than just assigning one variable to the other is that in Python, if I do that for lists, it would just create a reference. And if I manipulate any of the two variables, the same particular value will get manipulated. So I won't have two exact copies as such, but rather I'll have two variables pointing at the same quantity. Okay, so I can't manipulate one quantity without affecting the other. Okay, so that is why I have to create it in this way. Okay, so we have a grid now, and now we'll need to actually add those values in our GUI. Okay, yeah, you can call it GUI or GUI, whatever. So for doing that, we'll add a font, and in order to populate the Sudoku, I'll have a for loop inside a for loop. So for I in range 0 to length of grid, any particular array you can take of this 2D array. So I'll take grid 0 for j in range grid 0. So these are our loops, and we'll check if the value of grid is a valid number. So if it is between 1 and 9, then only we'll output it on the screen, right? So if it is between 0 and 10, not inclusive. So if this is the case, what we'll do is we'll have a variable called value, and we'll have my font dot render, and so we have to render the text which we want to add, and then we'll blit it on the screen. Okay, so str, since we want it in string, and grid ij. Okay, so this is the string version of our grid, and for the other parameters we'll specify true, and we'll need to have a color for these elements. So we'll make a variable out here, and we'll call it original grid element or something like that. So let's say original grid element color. Yeah, I know, very creative name. And we'll specify, let's say 52 comma 31 comma 151. So this will be the color of our grid elements. So I'm just doing this to separate the elements which will be there from the start from the elements which we'll be adding. Okay, so just as a distinction, I'm adding this. You can just keep it black, there's no issue in that. And okay, so I'll copy it here, and yeah, so this is my value, and I need to blit it on the screen. If you recall, whenever we add a text to a screen in Pygame, so what we do is we first render that particular text, and then we add it to the screen, and we add it to the screen by the blit function of Pygame. Okay, so win.blit, and the value which we are blitting, and the second parameter is where we're blitting it. Okay, so this is a bit tricky. So we have to specify the coordinates, right? And I and j are nothing but the indices, not even the indices, they are the grid box number. So we have to multiply the grid box number by some parameter, and if you recall, the width of each particular block was 50, right? So I can multiply I by 50 and j by 50 to get those values where I have to blit these values. Okay, and since these are zero indexed, they are starting from 0, I'll have to add a plus 1 out there. Okay, so I'll have j plus 1. So I'll get to why I'm adding j out here instead of I. So I'll get to that in a second. So let's have a buffer of 15. Okay, so these are the values which I found by trial and error. I'll have the same for I. Okay, yeah, so now let me just encapsulate them. So now the question is, why do we have a j here and why do we have an I here? Okay, so in order to do that, you need to look at the grids. Okay, so consider this grid. Okay, so out here you can see that these are the individual rows. So this will be the 0th index of I, and this will be the 4th index or the 3rd index of j. Okay, so that is how you'll access this particular value. Okay, so now the problem here is that if you see this value, so this, the second value which we said, This is the offset of from the x from the y-axis, right? So this particular 0 is at a distance of 3 from the y-axis. Okay, so this particular 0 should be denoted by the x coordinate, right? But out here it is denoted by j. Okay, since j is our inner looping element, inner looping variable, so that is why j basically traverses this part. Okay, and I traverses vertically. But when we are looking at the Pygame window, so the x coordinate is actually horizontal and y coordinate is vertical. So that is why I have to flip these values. Okay, so I hope that is clear. Just a simple distinction. So just the simple point here is that x coordinate has to be horizontal and y coordinate has to be vertical. But when we are traversing inside the loop, it is the opposite. Okay, by this figure you can see that the I values were vertical and the j values were horizontal. So we need to map j to the x values and I to the y values. Okay, yeah, so we are splitting these values out here, and I'll just have a display.update and then we'll see if we have any errors. Okay, so this is the window which you got. As you can see, the offset in y is a bit more than required, so I'll remove that offset and try again. Okay, so let's remove this and see what happens. I think it should run fine now. Yeah, so this, as you can see, so this is the very layout which we were planning to get, and the orientation seems proper. If you want, you can manipulate it further. So this is the basic window for our game, and now we just need to add the insert functionality, where the user can basically insert what he wants at some position. Okay, so basically if I want to insert a 5 out here, so I should be able to click on this particular grid block, and then if I press the number 5, the number 5 should show up here. So that's the functionality that's remaining, and so we'll add that now. So let's have a function called insert. Okay, and we'll take in the window and the position. Okay, so the window on which we're drawing and the position of the block. Okay, so first let's take my font, because we'll be needing the font. So let's run the loop directly. So imagine that this is being called whenever there is a click. Okay, so whenever there is a click, we will wait for any number input. So that is why we'll look at the events again. So for event in pygame dot event dot get, so we are looking for the event. So first of all, if the person is quitting, then we'll directly exit. So if event dot type equals pygame dot quit, then we'll return. And if event, so if it is key down, here we'll have three cases. So one is when the user tries to edit original file. The user should not be able to edit the values which are given to us by the API, right? Because if the user is able to edit that, then what is the point of the Sudoku? Because I can have any values out there. So that skeleton should remain constant. So the first priority should be to ensure that that original file is not being changed. And that is why we had the original grid variable above. Okay, so that will come in handy out here. And the second functionality is edit. Okay, so if the user has changed some value, has inputted some value, and we want to change that, so the user should be able to do that. Okay, so if in the course of the game you realize that there is some value which you have to change, you should be able to do that. Okay, so that is the second functionality which we need to have here. And the third and final functionality is the normal functionality of adding um, adding whatever digits you want. Okay, adding the digits. Okay, so this is just if I'm pressing 3, the 3 should get updated there as well as in the backend. So we'll update the grid 2D list for that, right? So it should get updated both in the list and as well as on the screen. Okay, So these are the three functionalities which we have to add here. Okay, so first priority is checking if the person is not editing the original block. In order to do that, we'll have to check the indices. So we are taking the position out here, right? So position will be some x and y value. Yeah. So out here, so we'll have some position for the blocks, right? So let's say that, so we're getting this block, okay? So this is the third block vertically and the first block horizontally. So it all depends on which value we'll be passing to this particular function. So let's say I'm getting the position of my mouse when I'm clicking this block. Okay, so what position am I getting out here? So I'm getting some x coordinate and y coordinate. Now what is that x coordinate? So that x coordinate is this distance. Okay, so according to x coordinate and y coordinate, this will lie in the first block from the x in terms of x coordinate, and the third block from the in terms of y coordinate. Okay, so that is why the coordinates of this will be 1 comma 3. Okay, so I have to translate that somehow to work in the uh, grid which I have. So when we pass the values, like this being the first block in the x direction and the third block in the y direction, what we need to keep in mind is that while we are making changes to the grid, that particular configuration would remain the same. But if we are making change in the backend, okay, so if we are making the change in the backend in this grid variable, the one which we defined earlier, so in that the change would be reversed, okay, just as we discussed when populating the grid. Okay, so we have to keep this in mind. So this twin paradigm sort of thing where we'll have to reverse the values when we make changes in our grid variable. We won't have to make any changes when we are populating the GUI or the application again, but when we are changing in the backend, we'll have to make those changes. Okay. Okay, so let's first pass this position variable, and then understanding it would get kind of easier. So I'll add the function call first, and then we'll look at the function definition. Okay. So I have to search for the event of mouse down. Okay. So if event dot type is equals to pygame dot mouse button up. Okay. And we are searching for a left click, and event dot button is equals to 1, so that is the left click. Okay, so whenever this happens, so I'll have a variable called pause, and I'll get the coordinates. So pygame dot mouse dot get pause. Okay, so I'll get the position of the of my mouse out here, and then I'll call the insert function. So I'll insert and I'll pass the window, and so instead of passing the entire pause variable, I'll divide it by 50. Okay, so the reason for doing that is that I'm getting that index which I mentioned earlier, right? So I'm dividing by 50. So basically I'm getting the grid number and I'm passing that grid number. Now I couldn't have just passed the mouse click coordinates, because if I were to do that, the person may click anywhere on the board and anywhere inside the block as well. So that value would have depended too much on where the person is actually clicking. Okay, so we have to eliminate that. So that is why we divided by 50, and now we just have a very nice round number which gives us the index. And when we want to do anything, when we want to map it back to the grid, we can multiply by 50, and in that case we'll get a very uniform value. Okay, so since we are chopping off the remainder, so the first thing which we need to do, we know that there will be an inversion of values when we want to update back in our database, as there was a shift in the x and y values. Okay, so the x values which we consider for the Pygame window are not the same as when we traverse a 2D list. Okay, so that is why I'll have two variables called I and j, and I'll store so these are basically for flipping it. Okay, so I'll have position 1 comma position 0. So whenever I need to update my grid variable, then I'll make use of I and j. So we're checking for key down. Okay, so whenever there's a key down, first we need to check if the position of the grid is if some skeleton of the grid is not being modified. Okay, so if grid original, and we have to specify I comma j since we are referring to database, and since these are not zero index, we have to zero index them by subtracting 1. Okay, so if this is not equal to 0, okay, so this means that if the original grid element is not empty, okay, so if the original grid element is not empty, I'll simply return. Yeah, so that is one case out. We are denoting blank values by 0, just in case you haven't noticed by now. So with this out of the play, so we can check if the value is correct or not. So the value has to be between 0 and 10, okay, so but 0 has a special purpose, okay, so the value 0, if the user input 0, that will be used for clearing an existing block, okay, so we can have that functionality. So if, so I want my event dot key is equals to 0, okay, so event dot key equals 0. So now what's the problem here is that 0 is mapped to the value of 48 in the ASCII nomenclature, okay, so we'll have to check with 48. So this basically means 0, okay, so this means checking with 0. Okay, so whenever this happens, whenever I'm just changing, sorry, whenever I'm just clearing an input field which I have supplied, which is not the skeleton which I have supplied, so in that case I should just erase whatever value has been updated out there and return. So so in order to update the value, so I'll have grad, and again I'll have I minus 1 comma j minus 1 equals event key minus 48. I'm just doing this to maintain uniformity. You could have assigned 0 directly, but it will become 0. Okay, so the value in the database will become 0. And now, so the $1,000,000 question is, how do I make my screen blank? Okay, so I cannot just have an erase. There's no erase button or functionality in Pygame. So what I can do is I can superimpose another block of the same color on top of that text. Okay, so that will make the text disappear, right? So I'll have a rectangle, I'll color it the same color as the background, and I'll superimpose it on top of the text. Okay, pretty simple. So pygame dot draw dot rect. Okay, so I'll draw a rectangle. Where I'll draw the rectangle is on the window, and the background color has to be the same as the one which you've used already. Okay, and the position. So the position will be position 0. So the coordinates which you have to, parameters which you have to specify out here are the x coordinate, y coordinate of the top left corner, and the width and the height. Okay, so position 0. So the x coordinate is position 0, and I have to multiply by 50 since I had divided by 50 out there. So I'll multiply by 50 to convert it into the coordinate, and position 1 into 50 again. Okay, so these are my x coordinates and y coordinates of the top left corner, and I want my block to be of the width 50 comma 50. Okay, since I want to color the entire block. Now can you spot a problem with this? Now since I'm coloring the entire block, there is actually no space left for the boundaries. So what I'll get is some of my boundary points would also get discolored because of this particular rectangle. So that is why I'll have something of a buffer. So a short buffer of, let's say, 5. Okay, so when I have this buffer, I'm basically ensuring that I'm not damaging my boundary line. Okay, so I'll add this everywhere. So in the x coordinate I'll add um, buffer, and I'll add it in the y coordinate as well, plus buffer, but I'll subtract it in the height and width because I want my height and width of the rectangle, the small rectangle which I'm drawing, to be smaller. Minus buffer, and here also minus buffer. So I hope this makes sense. So this rectangle has been drawn on the screen now. So I want to update my display so that I'll be able to view my change. So pygame.display.update. Okay, so if my event key was 0, I'm clearing the field. Okay, so now let's come to the meaty part. So if event.key lies between 1 and 9, okay, in this case we are inserting, so this is the main functionality. Okay, so whenever this happens, um, we are checking for valid input. Okay, checking for valid input. So whenever this valid input is there, we need to insert that input onto our screen. Okay, so the problem again here is that these values are not the ASCII values. So I'll simply subtract 48 from this, and now these values will become ASCII values. Since 1 is 49, 0 is 48. So if I had pressed 1, event.key will contain 49, and 49 minus 48 will give me 1. So if this happens, I have to insert it. Okay, so in order to insert it, so I'll first have to blur out the previous occupant out there because I don't want to overwrite. Okay, so once I've blurred this out, not blurred, I've removed this by superimposing another rectangle on top of it. And once I've done that, I'm ready to enter the new text. So value, so we'll just introduce the text the same way as we did below. So we'll have a value and we'll split it. Okay, so my font dot render str of event key minus 48, since I'm mapping these ASCII values to 1 to 9 numerical values, and then true followed by the color black because the text was black. Okay, so once this is done, so this is the text. Now I can blit it on the screen. So win dot blit and value, the position of blitting will be position 0 times 50. Okay, and I'll add 15 as we did earlier, and position 1, and we just need to do multi times 50, and we don't need to add any buffer out here because we saw earlier that no particular value of the buffer is required here. And we'll have to display the update. So pygame dot display dot update. So this is the functionality of inserting the text out there, and we'll have to add a return. So if this is done, then I'll return. Okay, so to sum it up, if we are pressing the quit button, we are quitting, and if there is a key down, we are first checking if the original skeleton is not being disturbed. If it is being disturbed, we are returning back. If the key pressed was 0, we are replacing whatever text we had there with a blank value. And if the key was a valid key between 1 and 9, what we are doing is we are first blanking whatever stuff was there, and then we are blitting the value which the user had pressed onto the screen. Okay, so there are a couple of changes. Okay, so this is grid, not grad. Okay, and out here I haven't assigned this value to the array. So grid is equals to, actually grid I minus 1 comma j minus 1 equals event dot key minus 48. Okay, so this is assigning the value, and this is grid. So we got this array, and this is not working, this is not working, 1 is not working. Oh, yeah, and this out here should be 0, not 1, because we have to include 1 in our values. Let's see if it works now. So I got my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I can see that it is interfering a bit on the lines. Okay, so I need to increase my buffer size. Yeah, so since there was a problem in the buffer, so let me just do it twice the buffer. So I have so a width comma height, right? So I'll just increase the width of my rectangular box to twice the buffer. Okay, so let's see, it should work now. So let's have a 4 here, and yeah, so it works pretty fine. Okay, I need to reduce a bit in height also. So these are just aesthetic changes. uh, so I'll have 2 into buffer. I'm not increasing the value of the buffer itself because that will change my initial x and y coordinates out here as well. Okay, so let's check it out now. Yeah, yeah, okay, now it seems perfect. So yeah, so I guess that's pretty much it about the code. So let me just input some random values and let's see if this is working. Okay, so if I want to erase this, I should press 0, and yeah, it got erased. If I want to update this, I should press the value which I desire. Okay, perfect. So it seems to be working perfectly fine. So let's have a sequence. So I'll have 2 0 1 1 5 3 7 9 2. Okay, so let's check the first four digits 2011 if we are getting 2011 in our output or not. Okay, so I'll just print grid, and yeah, we got 2011 out here. So it seems to be working fine. I don't think there are any errors out here, but we can always focus on more improvements. So there can be many improvements out here. So right now it is a very basic function, and we're just checking in the inside the grid. We're not checking outside the grid as well for some corner cases. So that is one point which you can focus on. Yeah, I guess this is pretty much it for the code. So if I were to recap this insert function, so we are checking for quit, and if we're not quitting, we're pressing checking for key down. If we're making any change to the original grid, we're returning. We're not allowing any change to the skeleton. And if the user had pressed 0, so we'll just delete whatever the user had typed before. We're not writing anything in that. We're just returning a blank block. Okay. And if the user has pressed a valid input on the valid block, then we're inserting the string. Okay. So I guess that sums up this basic Sudoku tutorial. And in the next video, we'll probably focus on backtracking algorithm to solve this Sudoku. So do look out for that. And yeah, thanks for watching.